The stagecoach rolled into Dusty Creek, Nevada, on a blistering Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1882, and the woman who stepped down from it wore a bruise along her jaw the color of a September storm cloud, and she called it a doorframe, the way some women learn to call things by softer names. Mabel Fletcher set both feet on the hard-packed earth of Main Street and stood still for a moment, as though she needed to reacquaint herself with the concept of solid ground beneath her. She was 26 years old, brown-eyed, and carrying one carpetbag that held everything she owned in the world. Her dark hair was pinned back in a way that had once been careful but was now just surviving, and the dress she wore was a faded blue cotton that had been washed so many times it remembered the color of the sky only vaguely, the way old people remember songs. She had a small cut at the corner of her lip that she had dabbed with a handkerchief somewhere around the Utah border, and then tucked the handkerchief back into her sleeve without comment. She looked like a woman who had made a very difficult decision and had not yet decided whether the decision was the right one. The town of Dusty Creek was not much to look at. It sat in a shallow valley between two red rock ridges, and it had the particular bleached appearance of a place that the sun had been arguing with for decades. There was a dry goods store, a livery, a church with a bell that only worked on Sundays, a saloon called the Copper Penny, a small schoolhouse at the far end of the street, a doctor's office that smelled like iodine and old wood, and a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Hazel Greer who charged $3 a month and included breakfast if you were down before 7. Mabel had a letter in her bag. The letter had been written to her by a woman named Clara Hutchins, who was her mother's cousin twice removed and who had told her in 3 paragraphs of tight, slanted handwriting that there was a position available at the Dusty Creek schoolhouse, that the previous schoolteacher had married a rancher and moved to California, and that a woman with Mabel's qualifications, 2 years of normal school in Ohio, a steady hand, and a willingness to live simply, would be received well. Clara had also added a postscript that said, "Come away from him, Mabel, before he gives you something worse than a bruise." Mabel had read that postscript 11 times on the train from Cincinnati to St. Louis and then folded the letter so the postscript faced inward and hadn't looked at it again. She stood on Main Street with her carpetbag and she did not cry, because she had made a policy of not crying in public that she had adopted around her 22nd birthday and had held to ever since. She looked up and down the street, got her bearings, spotted the boarding house sign 3 buildings down, and started walking. That was when she first saw Cornelius Reed. He was leaning against the post outside the dry goods store, not in any particularly dramatic way, just the way a man leans when he has finished one task and is considering the next. He was 30 years old, tall without making a performance of it, with dark sun-browned skin and hands that showed the kind of work they'd been doing for the past decade if you looked at them. He had dark brown eyes set under a straight brow, and he wore a worn leather vest over a plain white shirt, and the hat on his head was a well-maintained but obviously old Stetson the color of dark tobacco. He had a deputy's star pinned to the front of his vest, the silver dulled from years of wear. He was watching the stagecoach out of professional habit more than any particular interest, and then the woman stepped down, and he noticed the bruise the way men in his line of work notice things, quietly, completely, and without looking away. He watched her pick up her bag. He watched her stand still for that moment. He watched the careful, determined way she began walking down Main Street, and he noticed that she took inventory of the exits without appearing to do so a sweep of the eyes, casual as checking the weather, but tracking every alley mouth and door frame with the precision of someone who had learned to always know where the ways out were. He straightened up from the post. He did not cross the street. He did not call out to her. He did not introduce himself or offer assistance she hadn't asked for. He simply began walking in the same direction, at a distance that was not close enough to be alarming, and when she reached the door of Mrs. Greer's boarding house and pushed it open, he stopped at the far end of the porch and turned around so that he was facing the street, his back to the door she had just entered, standing between her and whatever might come from the direction she had arrived. He stood there for about 5 minutes. Nothing came. He walked back to the sheriff's office. That was the first day. Mabel was given a room on the second floor of the boarding house, small and clean with a window that faced east, which she liked because it meant morning light. Mrs. Greer was a brisk woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense manner that stopped just short of coldness, and she showed Mabel the room with the efficiency of someone who had done it many times. She did not comment on the bruise. She did not ask questions. She set a clean towel on the end of the bed and said, "Breakfast at 6:30, supper at 7, no guests after 8, and then she left. Mabel sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after that. The room was quiet except for the sound of the street below and far off, the wind moving through the ridge rock. She had not been in a quiet room alone for 3 years. She had forgotten how loud quiet could be. She unpacked her bag methodically. 2 dresses, one better than the other, a small case of toiletries, a Bible she had been given at her confirmation that she had not opened in 2 years. A tin box that held $42, which was all the money she had, and a photograph of her mother taken before Mabel was born. The woman in it young and light-eyed and looking sideways at something off-frame, as though she had heard something just a moment ago. A small notebook where Mabel kept lesson plans and observations about the children she had taught, which she had continued keeping even through the last 3 years, even when teaching had not been possible, because it was the one thing that had felt most like herself. She set the photograph on the windowsill where the morning light would find it, and then she lay back on the bed with her boots still on and stared at the ceiling until she fell asleep. In the morning she walked to the schoolhouse and met with Mayor Aldridge, a heavy-set man who ran the general store and also administered the town's civic business with the energetic incompetence of someone elected largely because no one else wanted the job. He was not unfriendly. He told her the school had 14 children, ages 6 to 14, that the previous teacher had left mid-year, and that the children had been without instruction for 2 months, that she would be paid $22 a month, and that the schoolhouse was hers to manage as she saw fit. He did not comment on the bruise either, but his eyes did move to it once and then move quickly away with the practiced politeness of a man who had learned somewhere that noticing things out loud was more trouble than it was worth. Mabel thanked him, shook his hand, and walked back through town to the schoolhouse to begin taking stock of what she had to work with. It was not much. The primer readers were 3 years out of date. The chalkboard had a crack running diagonally across one corner, and someone had left a box of chalk in a window that had let in rain, so half the chalk was a crumbled paste. But the room was sturdy, the roof was sound, and the wooden desks were solid if scarred, and Mabel had learned in her normal school training that the room itself mattered less than the person standing at the front of it. She was making a list of supplies she would need when the door opened behind her, and she turned around with the particular quickness of someone who has trained themselves over years to always know when a door opens behind them. The man in the doorway was the one she had noticed yesterday outside the dry goods store. Up close he was plainer than dramatic, which was somehow more trustworthy, no swagger, no performance of authority despite the badge, just a solid and watchful presence. He had a hat in his hands and he was holding it by the brim with both hands, which Mabel had learned years ago was something men did when they were trying to look non-threatening. "Miss Fletcher," he said, and his voice was a low, even baritone. "I'm Cornelius Reed, Deputy Sheriff. I wanted to come by and say welcome to Dusty Creek." "Thank you," she said, and she did not step toward him, but she did not step back either. "I won't take up your time," he said. "I just wanted you to know if there's anything you need, anything at all, doesn't matter what it is, you can come find me at the sheriff's office." She looked at him for a moment. She was trying to determine the nature of the offer, whether it was the routine courtesy of a lawman, or whether it was something else, something more pointed. His face didn't give her much to read. It was a patient face, the kind that had learned not to broadcast its thoughts. "That's kind of you," she said, and she kept her voice neutral. He nodded once. He put his hat back on. He turned and walked back through the door, and she heard his boots on the wooden porch steps, and then the sound of him walking away on the packed earth street. She stood in the empty schoolroom for a moment longer, and then she went back to her list. School started the following Monday. Mabel stood at the front of the room and looked at 14 faces ranging from an earnest 6-year-old named Tommy Briggs, whose front teeth were both missing, to a 14-year-old girl named Frances Aldridge, the mayor's daughter, who had the particular expression of a person who has decided in advance to be bored and is not yet sure how deeply to commit to the performance. Mabel had taught long enough to recognize that expression and to know that the children wearing it were sometimes the most interesting ones in the room, just the most defended. She did not introduce herself with a speech. She walked to the chalkboard, wrote her name, and then wrote 3 words under it: facts, questions, curiosity. She said, "Those 3 things are what we do in here. Facts are the bones. Questions are the muscles. Curiosity is what makes it all walk." Frances Aldridge's eyes moved to the board, and then back to Mabel with the beginning of a reassessment. Tommy Briggs raised his hand and asked if curiosity was like when you want to know if a horned toad could eat a scorpion, and Mabel said that was exactly what curiosity was, and they would look into it. By the end of the first week, she knew all their names, and several of them knew where Nevada had come from as a word, a Spanish word meaning snow-covered, and she had patched the cracked corner of the chalkboard with a strip of wood she had borrowed a hammer and nails from Mrs. Greer to install herself. She was walking back from the schoolhouse on Friday afternoon when she passed the Copper Penny Saloon, and a man came out of the doorway at an angle that put him directly in her path. He was large, red-faced, and smelling of whiskey, and he didn't mean anything by it. He was just a man who wasn't watching where he was going, but her body responded before her mind did, stepping sharply back and to the side with a neat efficiency that had been worn into her reflexes over 3 years of marriage to a man who came through doors in unpredictable ways. She collected herself instantly. The man muttered an apology and went on his way. But Cornelius Reed was across the street, leaning against the corner post of the sheriff's office, and he had seen it. Not the man walking into her, the response. The step back, the exact quality of it, the way it was too fast and too practiced to be ordinary startle. He didn't say anything. He did not cross the street to check on her or make an observation or look at her with pity, which she would have hated. He just met her eyes briefly across the distance with a look that was neither sympathy nor acknowledgement, but something quieter than either. A simple, steady recognition, the look of one person saying to another, "I see you," without requiring anything in return. She held his gaze for a half-second and then walked on. That night at supper in Mrs. Greer's dining room, there were 4 boarders, including Mabel, plus Mrs. Greer herself. A traveling salesman named Mr. Potts mentioned that Deputy Reed had apparently grown up in the area, that his father had been one of the early settlers in the valley, that he'd done a stretch as a cowhand on a ranch up near Elko before coming back and taking up the deputy position under Sheriff Hollis, who was a good man but getting on in years. Mr. Potts said this not because Mabel had asked about Cornelius Reed, but because Mr. Potts believed that the purpose of supper conversation was the broadcasting of everything he knew, and he knew a fair amount about everyone in Dusty Creek. Mabel ate her supper and listened, and did not indicate that any of this information was of particular interest to her. But she filed it away with the careful, quiet efficiency of a woman who had learned that knowing people was a form of safety. The second week of school brought a problem. A boy named Eli Carson, 10 years old, the son of a rancher who lived 4 miles out of town, was coming to school with the particular expression of a child who is not learning and has decided the remedy for this is to make noise. He interrupted. He threw chalk scraps at the back of Tommy Briggs's head. He announced on Wednesday morning that girls couldn't do mathematics, and Mabel turned from the board very calmly and said, "Frances, would you come up and solve the problem on the board?" And Frances Aldridge, who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity since the first day of school, walked up and solved it without hesitation and with a slightly elevated chin, and Mabel said, "Thank you, Francis," and turned back to Eli Carson and waited. He didn't throw anything at Tommy for the rest of the week. By the Friday of the second week, Mabel had found a comfortable enough rhythm that she allowed herself to feel, tentatively and without too much emphasis, that she had perhaps made the right decision in coming here. She was sitting on the boarding house porch in the early evening, the light going golden over the red rock ridges, with her notebook in her lap and a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm, when Cornelius Reed came walking down the street and stopped at the foot of the porch steps. "Evening, Miss Fletcher," he said. "Evening," she said. There was a moment where he could have moved on and didn't. He stood with his hands easy at his sides and looked at the ridge line the way a man looks at something he's been looking at all his life and still finds worth looking at. "How's the school going?" he asked. "Well," she said, "it's going well. I heard you handled Eli Carson. He just needed redirecting." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "His father's not an easy man." It was a small thing to say, deliberately small, and she understood exactly what it was aimed at. She looked at him steadily. "No," she said, "I expect he isn't." He nodded, like she had confirmed something he already knew. Then he said, "I'll let you get back to your evening," and touched the brim of his hat and walked on. She watched him go for longer than she meant to. The weeks settled into a pattern. Mabel taught school during the days, walked home in the evenings, sometimes stopped at the dry goods store for supplies or at the small lending library, really just a shelf at the back of the church to swap out books. She began to know the people of Dusty Creek the way you learn the geography of a new place, feature by feature. Mrs. Greer's dry humor that surfaced at unexpected moments, Dr. Calvin Webb's brisk competence and his habit of whistling the same hymn off-key while he worked, the Hendersons at the dry goods store who had 4 daughters and a son, and who gave Mabel credit for school supplies without being asked. The town had the roughness and particular beauty of all small western towns in those years. It was not an easy place, but it was a real one, and realness, Mabel had found, was something she valued more than ease. She did not talk about her husband. She did not say his name. She had left him in Cincinnati with the legal separation that Clara had helped her file, and a lawyer named Mr. Dewey who had told her in a very dry way that the law was not robustly on her side, but that if she was willing to be patient and document carefully, the separation would hold. She had a copy of the papers in the tin box under her bed, next to the $42 that was now $63, because she was careful with money and the school salary was steady. His name was George. That was the name she did not say. George Fletcher, who had married her when she was 22, and seemed in the first 8 months like a man who might be difficult but manageable, and had revealed himself in the 9th month as something considerably less manageable. She had stayed for 3 years with the particular combination of hope, economics, and shame that kept women in situations they should leave. And then Clara's letter had come, and something in her, some last remaining piece of the girl who had gone to normal school and loved teaching and believed things could be different, had said, "Enough." She kept his last name because changing it would have required explaining why, and she was not yet ready to explain anything to anyone. One evening in early October, about 6 weeks after she arrived, Mabel was walking back from the schoolhouse in the blue dusk when a rider came up behind her on the road. She heard the hooves and moved to the side of the road automatically, but the rider slowed to a walk instead of passing, and she turned around with the measured alertness she had learned was better than startling. It was Tom Aldridge, the mayor's eldest son, 19 years old and possessed of the particular combination of good looks and unchecked ego that made young men of his type temporarily difficult and eventually either humbling or catastrophic, depending on which way the character broke. He was not dangerous exactly, but he had ideas about himself, and he had decided in the past 2 weeks to walk past the schoolhouse at noon and again at 3 in the afternoon, which Mabel had noted with the flat internal recognition of someone who had seen that particular behavior before. Miss Fletcher, he said, walking his horse alongside her. Late to be walking alone. I walk home at this time every day, she said pleasantly, and kept walking. I could ride you back, he said. I appreciate the offer, she said, with the precise tone that meant she did not. He rode alongside her for another few strides, and then he said something that was meant to be charming and wasn't, and Mabel stopped walking and looked up at him with the calm of someone who has run out of the kind of patience that performs itself and said, "Mr. Aldridge, I'll be honest with you. I'm not looking for company, and I'd appreciate you riding on." He blinked. He had not been spoken to quite this directly by a woman before, and he was in the process of deciding whether to be offended by it when a sound behind them both turned their heads. Cornelius Reed was coming up the road on a bay horse, moving at an easy walk, the timing of it either coincidental or not, and his expression was entirely neutral as he came up alongside them. "Tom," he said. "Cornelius," Tom said, with a slightly deflated air. "Your father was looking for you about an hour ago," Cornelius said. "Something about the feed delivery." Tom looked between Mabel and Cornelius with the expression of a young man recalculating, and then he said, "I'll head back then," and turned his horse around. Mabel watched him go and then looked at Cornelius Reed, who was sitting easy on his bay horse and not looking at her with anything resembling triumph or the expectation of gratitude. "That was convenient timing," she said. "I ride this road most evenings," he said simply. She started walking again. He rode alongside her at the pace of her walking, which in other circumstances might have felt like being followed but somehow did not, and they were quiet together for a while, which was one of those quiets that has a texture to it. That means something. He wasn't going to do anything, she said, not because she believed it entirely but because she wanted to see what he would say. "No," he agreed. "He isn't that kind, but he also isn't the kind who takes a no the first time." She looked up at him. "How do you know what kind of man he is?" "I've been watching people in this town for 7 years," he said. "You get to know the shapes of things." They reached the boarding house. He stopped his horse at the foot of the porch steps, the way he always seemed to stop at the foot of the porch steps, not coming up onto the porch, just occupying that particular piece of ground. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. "Nothing to thank me for," he said, and that was not false modesty, it was, she realized, genuine. He truly did not think he had done anything. He had been there, and he would be there again, with the straightforward inevitability of a man who has decided where he stands and does not require recognition for standing there. She went inside, and she stood at the window for a moment and watched him ride back down the street toward the sheriff's office, and she thought about what it was like to be in the presence of someone who put themselves between you and the world without making you feel like a burden. It had been a very long time since she had felt that. October deepened. The light went amber, and the evenings got cold fast in the way of high desert evenings, the temperature dropping 20 degrees once the sun went behind the ridges. Mabel added a second blanket to her bed and bought wool for a pair of mittens from Mrs. Henderson at the dry goods store, and knitted them herself in the evenings by the boarding house fire, while Mr. Potts talked about various things and Mrs. Greer read in the other boarder. A young man named Henry, who was a land surveyor and very shy, stared at the fire and said nothing. She was knitting on a Thursday evening when Mrs. Greer, without looking up from her book, said, "Cornelius Reed is a good man." Mabel looked up. "Mrs. Greer turned a page. "He brought my husband's body back when he died," Mrs. Greer continued, still reading, "5 years ago last March. Rode 3 days to get him when no one else was going to bother. He never mentioned it again and never expected anything for it." Mabel held her knitting and waited because it was obvious that more was coming. "His mother was a Mexican woman from a ranching family down toward the border," Mrs. Greer went on, with the particular tone of someone delivering facts they feel should be stated plainly. "His father was a good man, but most of the town didn't consider him as such for that marriage. Cornelius grew up knowing what it was to be seen sideways by people. tends to make a man either mean or decent, and he went the decent way. She turned another page. Mabel looked at her knitting. "I'm not suggesting anything," Mrs. Greer said, with the tone of a woman who is absolutely suggesting something. Mabel said, "Of course not," and kept knitting. But she thought about it later, in the cold quiet of her east-facing room. And she thought about what it meant to grow up knowing you would be assessed for things you hadn't chosen, and how that might make a person develop a particular sensitivity to the way other people were being seen and assessed. She thought about the way he had noticed the bruise the first day and said nothing, absolutely nothing, had not made it a thing, had simply filed it and positioned himself accordingly. She thought about the way he stood at the bottom of porch steps and not the top. She wrote in her notebook, not a lesson plan this time, just the word careful, and then thought about it and crossed it out and wrote steady instead. The first time they had a real conversation, not the short exchanges at porch steps or road edges, but an actual sustained conversation, was in mid-October when the town held its autumn social in the church hall. Mabel attended because Mayor Aldridge had asked her to bring the students for a short demonstration of what they'd been learning, and she had the 14 children stand in front of about 60 adults and recite facts about Nevada history, and then perform the arithmetic problems she'd chalked on a portable board. And they did well, particularly Frances Aldridge, who had recently decided that being excellent at school was more interesting than being bored by it, and who solved a multiplication problem so rapidly that several adults clapped spontaneously. After the formal part was over, there was food. Mrs. Henderson had made a dried apple cake, and someone had brought a haunch of venison that had been roasting since morning, and people moved around and talked, and Mabel found herself standing at the edge of the room with a plate of food she was working through, watching the social dynamics of Dusty Creek with the quiet interest of someone who has always preferred observing to performing. Cornelius Reed appeared at her side, also with a plate, also apparently preferring the edge of the room. "Your students did well," he said. "They did," she agreed. "Frances in particular, she's bright, she was just bored before." "That's fixable," he said. "It is, with the right material." She looked at her plate. "Do you know Nevada history well? I've been working with the children on the territorial period." And they were off into a conversation about Nevada territory and statehood. Nevada had become a state in 1864, which was only 18 years prior. And he knew it not the way you know things from books, but the way you know things when you've grown up with them, with specific local detail and the kinds of personal family connections that made history feel lived rather than recorded. His maternal grandmother had come north from Sonora in the 1850s, during the period when the border between Mexico and the United States was still being negotiated in practice if not on paper. His father had come west from Tennessee in 1858, before the Civil War, and had stayed because the land had gotten into him. Mabel found herself leaning slightly forward, the way you lean when you are genuinely interested and have stopped monitoring yourself. He asked her about Ohio, where she had grown up, and she told him about the Miami River Valley where her parents had had a farm, and about the normal school in Columbus where she had studied for 2 years, and about the particular joy she had found in teaching, the way it felt like a precise match between a skill and a purpose. "What brought you out west?" he asked, and his voice was entirely even, not pressing, just the question itself lying there, and she knew he knew at least part of the answer and was giving her the option of how much to tell. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "I needed a new place." He nodded. He didn't pursue it. He refilled her water glass from the pitcher on the table behind her and then said, "Nevada has a way of being a new place for people. It doesn't hold on to what you brought with you the way older country does." She looked at him. "Do you believe that?" "I've seen it work that way for enough people," he said, "that I've stopped being skeptical about it." She was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet this time, not the defensive quiet of managing what she showed, but something softer, more open, like a window in warm weather. "What I need," she said after a moment, "is to simply be here long enough to stop waiting for the next thing to go wrong." He turned and looked at her then directly for the first time in a sustained way, and she met his eyes and held them. And there was a moment between them that was not about anything she had just said, but about the fact that she had said it, the fact of trusting him with it. "That takes time," he said, "but it comes." "How would you know?" she asked, not unkindly. "Because I've had my own version of it," he said quietly. She looked at him with a question in her face. He looked at his plate and then back at the room. "My father died when I was 21. I spent 2 years after that in a way that I don't look back on particularly well. And then I came back here and took the deputy position, and after a while I stopped waiting for the bottom to fall out of things." He was quiet. "I'm not saying it's the same." "No," she said, "but it's something." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the people of Dusty Creek eat and talk and laugh, and Mabel thought that this was the most real she had felt in company in a very long time. Not performing ease, but actually having it, at least for this hour, at least in this corner of a church hall in Nevada on an October evening. November arrived, and with it a development that Mabel had been half expecting and half dreading: a letter from George. He had found out where she was. She didn't know how, perhaps through Clara, perhaps through some other channel, but the letter arrived in the Dusty Creek Post addressed in his handwriting, his particular angled, heavy-handed script, and she knew it the moment Mrs. Greer handed her the mail at breakfast and said nothing, because Mrs. Greer had become the kind of woman who handed her things and said nothing in a way that suggested she was aware of considerably more than she indicated. Mabel took the letter to her room and sat at the edge of her bed and held it for a long time without opening it. Then she opened it. It was 3 pages, and it moved through several phases: contrition, then appeals to their marriage vows, then a shift into something with an edge to it, then back to contrition again, and then a final paragraph that said that he was a man of his word and that he expected her to be a woman of hers, and that he intended to come and discuss things with her in person, and that he trusted she would be sensible about the matter. She sat with the letter in her lap and the morning light coming through the east window and made herself breathe steadily. He had always used the word sensible as a weapon. Sensible meant compliant. Sensible meant stepping back into the container he had built for her and pretending the walls weren't there. She folded the letter and put it in the tin box with the separation papers, and then she went to school and taught mathematics and the geography of river systems, and did not think about it until noon. And then she thought about it very carefully during the noon hour while the children ran around outside, and she sat at her desk with her hands folded and arrived at several decisions, one of which was that she needed to have a conversation with Cornelius Reed. She went to the sheriff's office after school. She had never been inside it before. It was a small, practical room with a desk and 2 chairs and a gun rack, and a door at the back leading to the 2 cells, which were empty. There was a wood stove in the corner that was doing a vigorous job against the November cold, and the room smelled like wood smoke and gun oil and old coffee. Cornelius was at the desk, writing something in a log book. Sheriff Hollis, who was in his late 60s and mostly ran things from his chair these days with the authority of long tenure and the energy of a man conserving his resources, was not present. Cornelia stood up when she came in, with the automatic courtesy she had come to expect from him. He didn't ask what she needed. He just waited. She put the letter on the desk. He read it. She watched his face as he did, and it did not change much. She had noticed that about him, that he kept his face neutral when he was reading or listening, and his reactions came later considered, but there was something in the set of his jaw when he got to the last paragraph. He set the letter down. "He'll come," she said. "I believe he'll actually come." "When?" "I don't know. He doesn't say. He's not the kind of man who announces things in advance." She paused. "He doesn't like to give people time to prepare." Cornelius was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to tell me what happened? You don't have to. But if I need to deal with this, I should know what I'm dealing with." She sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited, which she would not have done 2 months ago, and she told him. She was precise and factual, and she used plain language, because she had found that euphemism made things smaller than they were when you were telling them to someone who needed to understand them clearly. She told him about the 3 years, the pattern of it, the way it had escalated and then pulled back, and the particular way hope operates in cycles and how cycles are a kind of trap. She told him about the separation filing. She told him about Clara's letter. She did not cry. She did not perform emotion. She just told it, and he listened with his full attention, not interrupting, not making sounds of reaction, just receiving what she said. When she was done, there was silence. Then he said, "You have the separation papers." "Yes. Nevada will honor them. And as a married woman seeking separation on grounds of cruelty, the law here isn't perfect, but it's workable. If he comes here and causes trouble, I can have him removed." "He'll say the trouble is mine," she said. "Men like him always do." "I've dealt with men like him before," he said, without heat but with an absolute flatness that was somehow more reassuring than anger would have been. "They count on other people accepting the way they frame things. I don't accept that framing." She looked at him across the desk. "You understand what I'm saying? He is convincing. He's a presentable man. He does not look the way people expect someone like him to look." "That's the most common version of it," he said. "The ones who look the part are the least dangerous because people can see them coming." She was quiet. Then she said, "You've seen this before." "My mother," he said simply, and then closed his mouth on whatever else might have followed that, and she understood that it was not something he spoke about easily or at length, and she did not press. They sat in the warm office for another moment, and then she said, "What do I do?" "Same thing you've been doing," he said. "Teach school, go about your life. If he comes, you tell me the moment you see him. You don't engage with him alone." "He has a legal right to speak with me," she said. "He does," Cornelius agreed. "He can do it with me present." She looked at him steadily. "You do that?" He met her eyes. "Miss Fletcher, I've been doing something like that since the day you stepped off the stagecoach." The admission hung in the air between them, quiet and exact and honest, and she felt something shift in her chest, not dramatically, not with the theatrical quality of a revelation, but with the steady, almost geological quality of something that had been changing for a long time and had just become visible. She stood up and picked up the letter from his desk. "Thank you," she said. "Come back if there's anything else," he said. "Doors always open." She walked out into the November afternoon and stood on the porch of the sheriff's office for a moment with her hand on the post, looking at the cold sky over the red rock ridges, and she thought, so that is how that works. She went back to the boarding house and wrote a reply to George's letter. It was very short. It said that the separation was legal, that she was settled in her position, and that if he felt the need to come to Dusty Creek and discuss matters, she would receive him at a time and place of her choosing in the presence of the deputy sheriff. She did not threaten, she did not beg, she did not apologize. She sealed the envelope with the particular care of someone who has finally found the exact right words, and she gave it to Mrs. Greer to add to the outgoing mail. Then she knitted half a mitten and went to bed and slept better than she had in 6 weeks. George Fletcher arrived on the first Friday of December. She saw him from the schoolhouse window. He had come by private coach, not the stagecoach but a hired rig from the next town, which was the kind of unnecessary display she recognized, the statement of a man who wants you to know he has resources. He was a compact man, 42 years old, with a neat brown beard going gray and the kind of well-pressed coat that made people assume he was respectable. And she had watched it work on people for years, that coat, and she felt something ancient and cold move through her when she saw him step down from the rig and stand in the middle of Main Street and look around with the proprietary air of a man claiming a room. She was aware that her hands had gone still on the book she was holding. She set the book down on her desk in a controlled way and said to the class, "Please continue your reading, Chapter 7, and walk to the door of the schoolhouse." She did not go outside. She stood in the doorframe of the schoolhouse, which put her slightly elevated on the steps above street level, and she waited. She did not have to wait long. Cornelius Reed came out of the sheriff's office in the same unhurried way he did everything, and she watched him cross the street toward the hired rig with the easy stride of a man who owns the ground he walks on, which in the best sense, in the legal and moral sense, was true. She could not hear what was said from the schoolhouse. She was 2 buildings away, but she could see the conversation. Cornelius's level posture, the badge clear on his chest, George with his chin slightly up, which was what he did when he was recalibrating his approach. She watched Cornelius lift one hand and indicate the direction of the sheriff's office, and watched George hesitate, and watched Cornelius wait with his hand still lifted, and after another moment George walked in the direction indicated. She let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 3 weeks. She went back inside and said, "Tommy, will you read the first paragraph of Chapter 7 aloud, please?" And the class continued. At noon she walked to the sheriff's office. She was prepared for this in the way she was now beginning to be prepared for difficult things. Not braced, exactly, which implied tension, but settled, grounded, knowing where her weight was. George was sitting in the chair across from the sheriff's desk, and Cornelius was leaning against the wall with his arms loosely folded, and Sheriff Hollis was behind the desk, his age-weathered face arranged in the polite neutrality of a man who has seen enough things to be impressed by very few of them. When she came in, George stood up with the automatic social reflex that had always been part of his presentation. He said, "Mabel," with a tone of warm reproach, as though she were a child who had wandered too far from home. "George," she said. She sat down in the second chair, which put her beside rather than across from him, and she folded her hands and looked at him with the evenness she had been practicing for months, the evenness that was not coldness but was something like clarity. He gave his speech. She had expected most of it, the appeals to duty, the suggestion that she had acted impulsively, the mention of their vows, the careful elision of everything that had made the vows untenable, the performance of reasonable concern. He was good at the speech. She had once been moved by versions of it. She sat and let it run its course. When he finished, she said, "I have a legal separation, George. I have a position here. I am not coming back." He turned to Cornelius and said, with the confiding reasonableness of a man turning to another man for sensible acknowledgement, "Surely you understand that a husband has certain rights in the matter of his wife." Cornelius was quiet for 1 beat. Then he said, in the same level voice he used for everything, "What I understand is that Miss Fletcher has a valid legal document, that this state recognizes it, and that she has a right to live and work here without being pressured. If you'd like to consult a lawyer about the separation agreement, I can direct you to one in Carson City. But if you're here to pressure her, that would be something I'd have to take issue with." George's reasonableness developed a hairline crack. "This is between me and my wife. She's your separated wife," Cornelius said, still without heat, "and she has indicated she doesn't wish to be spoken with alone. So I'm here. If that's an inconvenience, I apologize, but it doesn't change things." Sheriff Hollis said from behind his desk, "Son, I've been doing this job for 22 years. Take the deputy's advice and see a lawyer. Don't make this into something that requires a different kind of conversation." George stood up. He had the look of a man who has arrived at a situation having prepared for one kind of resistance and encountered another kind entirely, and is struggling with the recalibration. He looked at Mabel with an expression she recognized, not the hot anger but the cold kind, the kind that filed things away, and said, "We'll discuss this more appropriately at another time." "You can write to me through the post," Mabel said. "That's the appropriate channel." He picked up his hat, he walked out. Mabel sat in the chair for a moment after the door closed, and then she said, with the particular quietness of someone who has just seen a thing they have been afraid of for a long time, "He won't go easily." "No," Cornelius said. "He's not the going easily type." "But he'll go," Cornelius looked at her steadily. "He'll go." He was right. George spent 2 days in the nearest hotel, which was in the town 12 miles west, and he sent a note on Saturday afternoon requesting another meeting, and Mabel replied through the post that the matter was in the hands of her lawyer and she had nothing to add. On Sunday morning, she was told by Mrs. Greer, who seemed to know everything about everything that happened within 40 miles, that the hired rig had departed west. Mabel stood at her east window and felt the particular, enormous feeling of a threat withdrawing, not gone entirely. The separation would take time to finalize. There would likely be more letters, more attempts at pressure, but gone from her physical presence, out of her immediate space, and for now that was enough. She went to church that morning, which she had been doing most Sundays as a matter of community, and she sang the hymns with more attention than usual and sat in the wooden pew and felt the cold Nevada light come through the single-colored glass window. The church possessed green and amber, depicting nothing in particular, just color, and she thought about what it meant to be on the other side of something. After the service, walking out into the cold December morning, she found herself beside Cornelius on the church steps, both of them pausing to put on their coats before the air hit them. "He's gone," she said quietly. "Left this morning," he confirmed. "Thank you," she said, "for what you did in there both days." He looked at her. "You did the hard part," he said. "You sat in that chair and held your ground. I just stood by the wall." "There is a particular value," she said carefully, "in someone standing by the wall." He was quiet, and she saw something in his face that she had not seen there before, a small fracture in the habitual evenness, something warm showing through it, something that was almost uncertain, which was so unlike everything else about him that it made her look at him more carefully. "Miss Fletcher," he said, and then stopped. She waited. He looked at the ridge line. He looked back at her. He said, "I wonder if you would like to have supper with me sometime, not at the boarding house, at the hotel in town." She held the question for a moment, tasted it. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." December deepened into winter. The supper at the hotel was on a Wednesday evening when the dining room had only 3 other tables occupied, and they sat across from each other with a lamp between them and talked for 3 hours about everything. His years as a cowhand before the deputy position, the vast Nevada ranges where he had worked cattle, the particular and difficult beauty of that life, its physical demands and its long silences, and the way it made a man's body strong and his mind quiet. She talked about Ohio, about her parents' farm, about the river valley in autumn, and the way she had always felt most like herself in a classroom. They talked about books. She read voraciously. He read carefully and retained everything. And they discovered a shared admiration for the natural history essays that had been coming out of Eastern universities, the new science of the continent's geology and its plants and animals, the world being described and understood in real terms. She told him, that evening, with the lamp between them and the winter outside the windows, that the bruise on her jaw the day she arrived had been from a door she hadn't called a door. She said it with the same clear, factual language she had used in the sheriff's office, without drama or self-pity, just the plain truth of it, offered across a dinner table to a man she had come to trust enough to offer it. He listened in the same way he always listened, completely, without flinching, without performing reaction, and when she was done he said, "Does it help to have said it out loud to another person?" "Yes," she said, and was slightly surprised to find it was true. "Then I'm glad you told me," he said. He did not say he was sorry in a way that made it about him, and he did not say things would be all right in a way that was dismissive, and he did not look at her with the particular expression of pity that she had always found hardest to take, because pity made you small. He just received what she said and acknowledged it and moved forward with her, and she found that this, the simple act of being received and not diminished, was something she had been hungry for so long she had almost stopped knowing she was hungry. They walked back through the cold town after supper, the stars enormous overhead in the clear desert sky, the temperature dropping hard, their breath visible. She was wearing her good wool coat and the mittens she had knitted. He was hatless for the walk, his dark hair uncovered, and she thought that he looked, against the star-heavy sky, like someone in a painting she would have liked to own. At the boarding house porch steps, he stopped in his customary place, and she paused on the first step so they were closer to the same height. "This was a fine evening," she said. "It was," he agreed. There was a moment that could have been something, and he let it be what it was without pushing it. And she found that this too was remarkable, the way he did not take things that hadn't been given. She went inside and stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment in the warm hallway and pressed one hand briefly against her chest and felt her own heartbeat with a sort of wondering attention. January was cold and steady, the kind of cold that settles into the mountains of Nevada and stays. School continued. The children were reading at measurable improvement from where they had started, even Eli Carson, who had not thrown chalk at Tommy in 2 months, and had recently showed Mabel a drawing he had made of a coyote that was technically precise in a way that suggested genuine natural observation talent. Mabel had praised it seriously and had begun bringing him field guides to natural history from the lending library shelf, and he had started showing up 10 minutes before school each morning to read them before class started. Frances Aldridge asked Mabel one afternoon, in the careful offhand way of a teenager who wants information but cannot admit wanting it, whether Mabel was courting Cornelius Reed. Mabel said, "Where did you hear that?" Frances said, "Mrs. Potts told my mother and my mother told my aunt and I heard it through the kitchen wall." Mabel said, "It's not your business, Frances, and you know that, but since you're asking, we've had supper once." Frances's expression went through several interesting changes and settled on a pleased satisfaction she was trying to keep off her face. "He's a good man," she said, with the weighty authority of a 14-year-old who has been paying attention to the adult world. "Yes," Mabel said, "he is." They had supper again, and then again. They began walking together on Sunday afternoons out of town and up toward the lower ridge trails where the desert opened up into something vast and mineral and beautiful. He knew the land the way he knew the people, with the specific, layered knowledge of someone who had grown up inside it. He showed her sage grouse tracks in the sandy soil and the distinctive scratch of a kit fox, and she showed him, in turn, the particular way to ask a question that made a person want to answer it, which he said was a skill he wished he'd had earlier in his career. "It's the same principle as teaching," she said. "You start from what they know and you build outward. Most interrogation," he said dryly, "doesn't start from what they know in quite that spirit." She laughed, and she noticed, as she laughed, that she had been laughing more in the past 6 weeks than she had in the past 3 years combined. There was a physical quality to this that was almost disorienting. Laughter had a weight she'd forgotten, a warmth, the way it lived in the body for a moment after the sound was gone. He looked at her when she laughed with an expression she was learning to read, which was warmth very carefully contained, like a fire in a good stove not extinguished, just properly managed. "You have a good laugh," he said, and immediately looked back at the ridge line with the air of a man who has surprised himself. She looked at the ridge line too and said, "Thank you," and they walked on in the warm, companionable quiet that had become one of her favorite things about his company. It was on a Sunday walk in February, the light going sideways and gold through the cold air, when he stopped on the trail and turned to her and said, with the straightforward honesty that was, she had come to understand, simply his native language, "Mabel, I'd like to say something and I want you to tell me if I've misjudged the situation." She stopped too. She looked at him. "I think about you considerably more than I think is consistent with just being a friend," he said. "And I want to say that plainly, because I think you've had enough of things being said around the edges of what they actually are." She was quiet. She looked at him in the golden February light, this solid, careful, steady man who had put himself between her and every door that might have been a danger since the day she arrived, who had stood at the bottom of her porch steps every time as though proximity was something to be earned and not assumed, who had heard the worst of her history without flinching, and had not once treated her as though it diminished her. "You haven't misjudged it," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that controlled warmth, and then he reached out and took her hand with a deliberateness that was the opposite of rushing the way Someone picks up something fragile and rare, knowing its value. She let him. She turned her hand in his and held it. They stood on the ridge trail in the cold February air with their hands clasped, and the vast Nevada landscape spread out below them, and the sky overhead enormous and blue and entirely unhurried, and she thought, this is what safe feels like. This is what it is when someone stands by the wall because they mean it, not as a performance, but as a fact. Spring came to the Nevada desert the way it came there every year, not softly, like spring in Ohio, but with a kind of bright, hard, mineral energy, the sage going green overnight, the creek running fast from the mountain snowmelt, the sky acquiring an altitude and clarity that was specific to that latitude and season. Mabel had been in Dusty Creek for 9 months. The school year was approaching its end. Frances Aldridge had submitted work to a girls' school examination in Sacramento that Mabel had been coaching her for, and she was waiting for the results with a combination of confidence and terror that Mabel found entirely admirable. Eli Carson had started sketching every species in the field guides he had been borrowing, and Mabel had written a letter to a natural history professor at a university in San Francisco describing his work and asking about the possibility of correspondence, and had received a reply that was more interested than she had hoped. Tommy Briggs had his front teeth back. The letter from Mabel's lawyer arrived in late March. The separation had been finalized. The papers were signed and recorded. Mabel Fletcher was, in the eyes of the law, a free woman. She sat with the papers on her bed in the east-facing room that had become, over 9 months, something she thought of as home, and she read them twice and then set them down and looked at the photograph of her mother on the windowsill and said, quietly and to herself and to the photograph both, "There it is." She was not crying. She was not performing anything. She was just sitting with the fact of it, the clean finality of it, the door closed behind her and the land ahead. She brought the papers to Cornelius that evening. He read them and she watched the particular quality of relief move through him, not dramatic, not theatrical, just a slight loosening of something that had been held, and he folded them carefully and handed them back and said, "Good, good," she agreed. He looked at her for a moment. "How does it feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like waking up after a very long time of not sleeping well," she said. "Disorienting and better at the same time." He nodded slowly. "That seems exactly right." She tucked the papers into her coat. She was standing in the middle of the sheriff's office, the warm stove at her back, the evening light through the single window, and she thought later, trying to find the precise language for it, she felt like herself. The particular self she had been before the 3 years, the version that had gone to normal school and believed in things and laughed without calculating whether it was safe to. She said, "Cornelius." He looked at her. She crossed the space between them, which was not very large, and she kissed him on the mouth, simply and directly, because she had made a decision, and she did not make decisions she did not follow through on, and because he had been waiting, she suspected, with the enormous patience of a man who will wait for exactly as long as necessary without complaining about the waiting. He kissed her back with a warmth and care that felt entirely consistent with who he was, not rushed, not consuming, just present, completely present, the full attention of a person who is not anywhere else. When she stepped back, she was looking at him with bright eyes, not quite laughing but close. He said with the wonderfully understated evenness of his habitual voice, "I've been hoping you would do that for some months." "I know," she said. And now she was laughing, and the laughter had that warm weight in her chest, and the light was going golden through the window, and Dusty Creek, Nevada in the spring of 1883, was the most beautiful place she had ever been. The spring moved into summer. The school year ended with a ceremony in the church that brought out most of the town, because Mabel had organized it as a real demonstration of what the children had learned. Not just recitation, but projects. Eli Carson's natural history sketches displayed on the wall, Frances Aldridge leading a discussion of Nevada geography, Tommy Briggs reading aloud a paragraph from a book about rivers with a precision and fluency that made his mother put her hand over her mouth. Frances received her letter from the Sacramento school. She had been accepted. She came to Mabel with the letter trembling in her hand and her composure very slightly cracked at the edges, and Mabel said, "Frances," and opened her arms, and Frances, who was 14 and had decided on her first day of school to be above all of it, walked into the hug and held on for a moment with her eyes shut. "You did that," Mabel said. "Not me. You. You gave me the material," Frances said, with her composure reassembling around her. "You chose to use it," Mabel said. "There's a difference." It was a warm July evening when Cornelius asked her to marry him. They were sitting on the boarding house porch after supper. She had moved off the porch into the yard to look at a hawk that was circling above the ridge, and he had followed her, and they were standing in the dry grass with the last light dying in the west and the stars beginning to show in the east. He did not kneel. He just turned to her and said, with the plain directness that had been the most recognizable thing about him since the beginning, "Mabel, I would like you to be my wife. I know you've had reasons not to trust that arrangement, and I know it takes more than 9 months to undo 3 years, but I want to tell you clearly what I am and what I'm not. I am not a man who will stand between you and the door in the way you've had to be careful of before. I will stand between you and anything coming at you from outside, for as long as I'm alive, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you have a room of your own to go to whenever you need it." She looked at him in the last light of the July evening. She thought about all of it, the bruise she had called a door frame on the day she arrived, the way he had noticed and said nothing and simply positioned himself, the months of walking and talking and building something with the same careful, steady construction with which he did everything. She thought about the east-facing window and the morning light. She thought about Frances reading with her head up and Eli's sketches and Tommy's missing teeth growing back. She said, "Yes, Cornelius, I want to be your wife." He took both her hands in his, and she felt the familiar quality of his grip, careful, solid, certain. And the stars were coming fully out now over the Nevada dark, thick and indifferent and vast, and she thought that this was the kind of moment you kept inside yourself for the rest of your life, not because it was theatrical but because it was real. They were married in October, a year and a few weeks after Mabel had stepped off the stagecoach with her carpetbag and her bruise. The ceremony was in the Dusty Creek Church, conducted by the Reverend Mills, and attended by what seemed like most of the town, which was another thing about small western towns. They did not underattend significant events. Mrs. Greer wore her good black dress and stood in the front row and did not cry, though she held a handkerchief that she did not return to her pocket until well after the ceremony was over. Mayor Aldridge gave a toast at the reception in the church hall that was more heartfelt than most of his civic announcements. Dr. Calvin Webb played the fiddle at the reception dance and only got the hymn wrong twice. Mabel wore a dress she had made herself from pale green fabric that Mrs. Henderson had ordered specially from Carson City. It was the most beautiful garment she had ever owned. She had put her hair up, and Mrs. Greer had pressed a small flower from the window box into it, a late-season bloom that was more brown than pink but was present, and it counted. Cornelius looked at her when she came into the church with the expression she had first seen fracturing through his evenness back in December, but now it was fully present, fully shown love, clear and warm and certain, not contained anymore but offered directly and without apology. She walked down the aisle toward him thinking, "I chose this. Of all the things that have happened to me, this is the one I chose." They moved into the house that had been his, a 4-room frame house on the eastern edge of town, close enough to the ridge to hear the wind in the rock on quiet nights. It was plain and solid, and she made it hers with the same quiet efficiency with which she had made the schoolroom hers. The photograph of her mother on the kitchen windowsill now, facing the morning light, a braided rug she made from wool scraps over the winter, curtains in a pattern she liked, books on the shelf beside his books. She continued teaching. There had been a question from some members of the town about whether a married woman ought to continue in the position, and Mabel had addressed it at a town meeting with the measured calm of someone who has decided certain fights are worth having. And Mayor Aldridge, who had a complicated but ultimately decent character, had said that the children of Dusty Creek had done better in the past year than any year prior, and that whatever arrangements Miss Fletcher, Mrs. Reed, he corrected himself, wished to maintain regarding her employment were fine with the town. The question was not raised again. The first winter of their marriage was the best winter Mabel had known in her memory. Not because it was easy, there were adjustments, the particular friction of two people learning to live inside the same walls, the way habits clash before they harmonize, the nights when she woke from a dream with her heart going too fast and had to remind herself where she was. But he was there, and he was what he had always been: steady, unhurried, present without crowding. And she found that the adjustments were the normal kind, the kind that are worth making. He made her coffee in the mornings before she was fully awake, not as a performance of husbandly virtue, but just because he was up first and made 2 cups as naturally as he made one. She read to him in the evening sometimes from whatever she was working through, and he listened with the full attention she had come to love, occasionally asking a question that showed he had followed every word. They talked about everything: the school, his work, the town, the politics of Nevada, the wider world that came to them through newspapers 2 weeks delayed, and which they read and discussed with the engaged interest of people who believe the world is their concern even when it is far away. In the spring of 1884, Mabel realized she was expecting a child. She told Cornelius on a Sunday morning in March, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee between them, with the direct simplicity that was, by now, their shared language. She said, "I believe we're going to have a child." He put down his coffee cup. He looked at her across the table with the extraordinary quality of a person in the presence of something that exceeds their capacity to be even, and his composure broke beautifully, not into sadness or fear, but into a warmth so intense it was almost visible, something he didn't try to contain, just let show. He said, "Mabel," very quietly. She said, "I know." He came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took her hands, and she leaned her forehead against his hair, and they stayed like that in the spring morning kitchen for a long time. Their son was born in November of 1884, a November child, which Mabel found privately satisfying, given that it had been November when she had first truly understood the shape of what was growing between her and Cornelius. He came into the world with the particular force and volume of a healthy newborn, and Dr. Calvin Webb announced in his brisk, off-key manner that he was a fine specimen, which made Mabel laugh from exhaustion and relief. They named him James William Reed James for his paternal grandfather, William because Mabel had always liked the plainness of it. He had Cornelius's dark eyes and Mabel's particular determined expression when he encountered something he found unsatisfactory, which, being a newborn, was fairly often. Cornelius held his son for the first time with the careful deliberateness with which he held everything of value, and Mabel watched him from the bed with the enormous tiredness and the enormous fullness of the hours after a birth. And she thought about all the ways a person could be protected, the formal and dramatic ways, the ways with guns and authority, and then the other way, the daily, ordinary, constant way of someone who simply places themselves between you and what might hurt you and does not announce it or require praise for it, just does it, as a matter of who they are. The years that followed were full ones. James grew into a running, climbing, relentlessly curious boy who was, by age 4, showing Mabel his father's habit of watching things very carefully before acting, which she found simultaneously useful and exhausting. Cornelius taught him to read trail sign before he was 5, and Mabel taught him his letters and numbers at the kitchen table with the same care she brought to her schoolroom. The school in Dusty Creek grew. By 1886, there were 22 students, and Mabel had organized a petition to the town council for a larger building, which was approved largely, because she had also compiled the educational outcomes data from the past 4 years into a report that made the case simply and irrefutably. The new schoolhouse had 2 rooms and a covered porch, and Mayor Aldridge cut the ribbon with an air of civic pride that Mabel found amusing given that she had done essentially all the work. Cornelius was made full sheriff in early 1886 when Sheriff Hollis retired, stepping down at 68 with a grace that Mabel thought spoke well of him, passing the office to the man who had been running it practically for 2 years. The ceremony was a modest one, the badge change done in the office with a few witnesses, and Cornelius wore the new badge with the same quiet plainness with which he wore everything, not as an elevation, just as a fact. He brought new standards to the office. He was firm, fair, and possessed of an unusual capacity for de-escalating situations through the simple authority of his presence and the way he spoke. That level, unhurried voice that said, "I am not afraid and I am not angry, and therefore there is no need for this to go further." In the 3 years of his full sheriffhood before 1887, the town's incidence of serious violence dropped measurably, and the pattern of domestic trouble that had historically gone unaddressed began to be addressed, quietly and persistently, because he had made clear that the office would not look the other way. Several women in Dusty Creek during those years received the same wordless position protection that Mabel had received the deputy or the sheriff standing by the wall, standing between them and every door, without fanfare, and without requiring the women to perform gratitude. Mabel knew about some of these cases. She never asked about others. But she recognized the pattern, and she loved him for it with a love that was specific to the thing, the love of someone who has been seen for what they needed, and who watches the same sight being offered to others. Frances Aldridge wrote from Sacramento in 1885, then again in 1886. She had finished her schooling and was teaching mathematics at a girls' school. Her letters to Mabel were precise and warm and full of the particular voice she had been developing since the day she walked up to solve the problem on the chalkboard. Mabel wrote back with the same care and frequency. Eli Carson eventually made it to San Francisco. The natural history professor he had been corresponding with since age 12 helped him obtain a position at a museum there when he was 17, and he came to say goodbye to Mabel on the morning of his departure with his portfolio of drawings under his arm and his earnest face showing all the complex feelings of departure without trying to hide any of them. She shook his hand and then changed her mind and gave him a firm, brief hug and said, "You did this, Eli. You drew every sketch." "You brought me the books," he said. "I'll keep bringing them," she said, "to whoever needs them next." The summer of 1887 brought Mabel's cousin Clara to Dusty Creek for a 2-week visit, the first time they had seen each other in 5 years. Clara was 50, practical, and possessed of the no-nonsense warmth of women who have devoted their lives to doing necessary things without expecting recognition for them. She and Mabel sat on the porch in the evenings and talked in the deep, effortless way of 2 people who have known each other long enough to skip the surfaces entirely. On the 3rd evening, watching James run in the yard with the neighbor's dog and Cornelius fix the porch railing with the careful attention he brought to everything physical, Clara said to Mabel, "You look different." "Different how?" Mabel said. "Like yourself," Clara said. "Like the girl in Columbus before everything went sideways." Mabel watched her husband and her son in the long summer evening light. "I think," she said slowly, "it's more like myself than I was even then, because then I was just starting. I hadn't earned anything yet." Clara nodded with the particular nodding of a woman whose instincts about people have been confirmed. "He's a good man," she said. "He's the best man I know," Mabel said, simply and certainly. Clara stayed 2 weeks and cried the morning she left, which surprised her visibly, and Mabel hugged her at the stagecoach door and said, "Thank you for the postscript. I read it 11 times." Clara held on for a moment and then let go and climbed up, and the stage rolled out of Dusty Creek, and Mabel stood on the street and watched it go and felt the gratitude of someone who has been handed the right direction at the right moment, the small human kindness that redirects a life. That autumn Mabel discovered she was expecting their second child. She was 32. She told Cornelius on a Sunday morning again, at the kitchen table again, with the same direct simplicity, and he came around the table again. But this time he laughed first, a full, warm, surprised laugh, and swept her up out of the chair with a care that was simultaneously strong and gentle, and she put her arms around his neck and laughed with him. James was 3 and deeply interested in the news when they explained it to him. He asked several logistical questions that Mabel found genuinely challenging and Cornelius found extraordinarily funny, and then James said, with the decisive tone of someone who has rendered a verdict, "I want a brother," and went back to building his structure of wooden blocks. In April of 1888, Mabel gave birth to their daughter, Wren. James, presented with Wren, looked at her for a long time with the considering expression that was so purely his father's it was almost uncanny. And then he said, "She's very small," and touched her hand with one careful finger, and Wren's fingers closed around his with the automatic grip of a newborn, and James looked up at his parents with an expression that was all his own wonder, completely unguarded. Mabel lay in the bedroom of the house on the eastern edge of Dusty Creek. The window opened to the April air coming down off the Red Rock Ridge, and she looked at her husband holding their daughter and her son leaning against his father's knee with his careful eyes on his sister's face. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 6 years ago with a bruise she called an accident, carrying one carpetbag and $42, and the photograph of her mother, and a notebook full of lesson plans. She thought about how that woman had stood still for a moment on the main street of a small Nevada town, taking inventory of the exits, and how a man had seen her do it, and had said nothing, and had simply walked in the same direction, and placed himself between her and whatever might come. She thought about how long it had taken her to learn that the doors he stood in front of were not keeping her in, they were keeping other things out. She pressed one hand to her chest and felt her own heartbeat, sure and steady, and she thought, "I am exactly here. I am exactly where I chose to be." Outside the window, the Nevada spring was making itself known in all its hard-edged, mineral glory, the sage gone fresh green, the creek running full from the snowmelt, the sky a blue so deep and wide it seemed almost arrogant in its beauty. The wind came through the ridge rock with the low, harmonic sound it made in that particular geography, a sound she had learned to love, a sound that was now so associated with home that she could not imagine hearing it anywhere else. Cornelius came and sat on the edge of the bed with Wren, and James climbed up and fitted himself against Mabel's side with the easy, unconscious trust of a child who has never needed to calculate whether the space beside his mother is safe. And Mabel put her arm around him and leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, and held all of them in her attention for a moment with the careful, grateful, whole attention of a woman who knows what it costs to arrive here, and does not take a single ordinary morning for granted. Wren made a small sound, not crying, just the sound of a person announcing their presence to a world they have not yet assessed, and James said, "She's talking," with absolute certainty. "She is," Mabel agreed. "What is she saying?" James asked. Mabel looked at her daughter's face, the dark eyes just beginning to focus, the infinitely new expression of a person at the very start of everything. "I think," she said, "she's saying she's here." The years ahead would not always be simple. The West was still a hard country in 1888, with its distances and its difficulties and its injustices. The injustices written into its laws and its land policies, the ways certain people were seen and not seen, the work that remained to be done and would remain for generations. Cornelius Reed, wearing his sheriff's badge in a county where his parentage had once been grounds for sideways looks, continued to do that work with the same level, unhurried persistence with which he did everything. And Mabel Reed, teaching school in a town where women's professional lives were considered conditional on the permission of men, continued to do her work with the same clear, direct efficiency, and neither of them believed that the world was finished being made, but both of them believed in the making. James grew, Wren grew. The schoolroom filled and emptied and filled again, year after year, with children who learned their letters and their numbers, and the names of rivers and the particular fact that a horned toad could, in some specific circumstances, outmaneuver a scorpion. A matter Mabel had eventually researched and confirmed for Tommy Briggs, who was 12 by then and still delighted by the answer. On a September evening in 1890, when the air was that particular gold of Nevada autumn and the ridge shadows were long across the house, Mabel and Cornelius sat on the porch after supper. James, 6 years old and tireless, was chasing lightning bugs at the edge of the yard. Wren, too, was asleep in Cornelius's lap with the total and trusting unconsciousness of a child for whom the world has always been exactly what it appeared to be. Mabel had her notebook in her lap, not lesson plans, though those were in there too. She had been writing in it more personally in the past year, not a diary exactly, but observations, the way she had always observed things, the way she had written careful into her notebook in her first weeks in Dusty Creek and crossed it out and written steady instead. She looked up from the page and looked at her husband and her sleeping daughter and her running son and the long autumn light on the red rock ridges, and she wrote, "Here," and held it in steady and chosen. Then she closed the notebook and set it on the porch rail and said, "Cornelius." He looked at her in the evening light with the warm, unhurried attention that was the most constant thing she knew. "Thank you," she said, "for standing by the wall." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at their daughter's sleeping face, and then at their son running through the dusk and then back at her. "Thank you," he said, "for walking through the door." The lightning bugs rose in the low dark of the yard, small lights moving against the deepening blue of the Nevada evening, and the wind came down from the ridge with its low, harmonic sound, and somewhere down Main Street, a dog barked once and was quiet, and the stars began coming out one by one in the east, over the mountains, over the desert, over the small town that had been new enough to hold a woman who needed a new place. Mabel Fletcher had arrived in Dusty Creek with a bruise she called an accident. She had built a life there that she would not have traded for any other. And every morning when the light came through the east window and fell on the photograph of her mother's young face, tilted sideways to hear something, Mabel thought that her mother had been listening for exactly this. The sound of a door that opens both ways, the particular and ordinary miracle of being where you chose to be, loved by someone who understood, from the very beginning, that the most important thing about the way you stand near a person is whether they can always, freely and without condition, walk away. She could, she had. She had also walked toward, which was the other half of the thing. And that, she thought on those mornings, with the coffee cup warm in her hands and the sound of her household waking around her, was everything.